to Thought Experiments. I have some interesting literature that I want to get into. Gentleman's name that I've heard for many, many years, but just really kind of checking this guy out. It's kind of relevant to the war situation, as it were, going on in the Middle East. A gentleman by the name of Noam Chomsky. So we're gonna get into some of this work. Recently, a YouTube colleague of mine sent over a video, and it was to a documentary, a summary of Chomsky's analysis on how the corporate media functions. It is an excerpt from the documentary Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky and the Media, 1992. We're gonna go over some clips from this documentary that I've kind of selected, and I'm just really interested in, I'm such a nerd about the idea of propaganda and media and its impact on the hearts and minds of the masses, and see how that correlates with some current events and really, in a lot of ways, events that have taken place in the last 20 years. We want to look at it through this lens of media propaganda and who stands to benefit from forging your worldview in a particular way. Checking out this documentary and setting up for this particular presentation, I went ahead and ordered this book, Manufacturing Consent. Let's get into just a little bit of Manufacturing Consent before I get into the clips. And this is Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. The Political Economy of the Mass Media is sort of the subtitle. Super duper interesting, can't wait to get into this. A propaganda model. The mass media serve as a system for communicating messages and symbols to the general populace. It is their function to amuse, entertain, and inform, and to inculcate individuals with the views, beliefs, and codes of behavior that will integrate them into the institutional structures of the larger society. In a world of concentrated wealth and major conflicts of class interest, to fulfill this role requires systematic propaganda. Chapter 1, Propaganda Model, first paragraph. Great stuff. So I'm gonna go over this a lot more as I read into this. This might end up being a series because I'm looking to get into as much content as I can, really illustrating the importance of understanding how social engineering works relative to media, propaganda, mainstream media, alternative media, the concept of why there's even a dichotomy of such things, right? So stick with me here. We're gonna do a little bit of thought experimentation and see how we can arrive at different levels of empowerment relative to understanding how these things have impact on our lives and on the lives of our friends and family, and collectively as we share this world, and see what we can do about it along the lines of, again, empowering ourselves to maybe not be subject to these the workings of these things. Just so we have a little bit of background, Noam Chomsky, born December 7th, 1928, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, American theoretical linguist whose work from the 1950s revolutionized the field of linguistics by treating language as a uniquely human, biologically based cognitive capacity. Through his contributions to linguistics and related fields, including cognitive psychology and the philosophies of mind and language, Chomsky helped to initiate and sustain what came to be known as the cognitive revolution. Chomsky also gained a worldwide following as a political dissident for his analysis of the pernicious influence of economic elites on U.S. and domestic policies, foreign policy, and intellectual culture. I love this stuff. We're gonna get into some Edward Bernays as well, so we're gonna have a blast. Thought experiments. Let's get into these video clips and just kind of give you my thoughts on it.
You write in Manufacturing Consent that it's the primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Mobilize public support. I mean, we're already off to a great start, right? Mobilize public support.
Primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that...
It only gets better. It only gets better. It only gets better.
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, The first place to look is who's in a position to make the decisions.
Who's in a place to make the decisions?
Determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, the major decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations.
In the hands of a very small group of people. Like, you have to understand the gravity of what he's breaking down here.
And conglomerates and investment firms and so on, they are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones
who own the media, and they're tied into the government.
They're the ones who have to be in a position to make the decisions.
So you see what he's saying, a small group of people, and they're interwoven through media. And again, that's where my wheelhouse is, just really understanding the influence that someone has when they hold the reins of the media. Then of course, as he described, they're tied in with the government. So government, media, handshake. Fast forward to now, tie that in with the pharmaceutical industry, medical industry, captured regulatory agencies. And you see, we have a very beautiful recipe for absolute madness.
When we're talking about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
Whose consent is being manufactured?
We can, to start with, there are two different groups. We can get into more detail, but at the first level of approximation, there's two targets for propaganda. One is what's sometimes called the political class.
Two targets for the propaganda.
There's maybe 20% of the population, which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. They play some kind of role in decision making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on.
Managers, cultural managers, teachers, writers, this 20% educated class.
They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. One group that has to be deeply indoctrinated.
Then there's the other 80%.
Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think,
Whose main function is to follow orders and not to think.
Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything.
You see where this goes, right? Like, really extrapolate what's being described here. And this is from 1992. Really fast forward this out 30 plus years. The last 4 years, 3.5 years, 4 years. Ukraine, what's going on right now? Israel, Palestine. Really think it through. You see where I'm going with this and why I selected this piece to do a presentation on with this particular gentleman, who is, by the way, a Jewish gentleman as well.
All right, Professor Chomsky, Noam, you outlined a model with filters that propaganda is sent through on its way to the public. Can you briefly outline those?
It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media, what we call a propaganda model.
Propaganda model.
We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others...
The national media, the media that sets the national agenda.
That others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media.
The agenda-setting media, the elite media.
That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. Local media more or less adapt to their structure.
So national media and then the local media basically follows suit. So we're seeing the framework here, the hierarchy, the path of information, the way it's flowing. Extremely interesting stuff, and of course, as you can see by now, in the wrong hands, how dangerous this bit of technology, so to speak, can be.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in society.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups. This is Noam Chomsky breaking this down in his documentary, Manufacturing Consent. We're going to get into the book later. We'll highlight some pieces from this and report back as well. Because again, we want to stay as objective as possible and really understand what we're dealing with. Just thought experiments here, right? Because maybe, just maybe, there are people who are looking to manipulate our worldview for their best interest, not our best interest, for their best interest. So we want to look at and take advantage of any opportunity where we have people who are maybe hailed as leaders, thought leaders. This particular gentleman has credentials that go back decades and is hailed as somewhat of a thought leader in linguistics and philosophy. So let's take a few pages out of his book. And again, this is no specific nod to my position on this guy or his information, but he is somebody who is hailed as a leader to some degree in these fields. And for me, from a journalistic perspective, I just want to look into what this gentleman is saying. And anytime I see something to the effect of manufacturing consent or manufacturing relative to propagandization, social engineering, I mean, it literally says on the cover of his book, the political economy of the mass media. Oh yeah, I'm definitely interested in that, and that falls right in line with what we're doing here with Thought Experiment.
The New York Times is certainly the most important newspaper in the United States, and one could argue the most important newspaper in the world. The New York Times plays an enormous role in shaping the perception of the current world on the part of the politically active, educated classes. Also, the New York Times has a special role, and I believe its editors probably feel that they bear a heavy burden in the sense that the New York Times creates history.
The New York Times creates history. Creates history. I mean, think of the gravity of the way you phrase that, right? Creates history because of the power and influence it has. And again, this is 1992, so let's run that forward 30 plus years. And now we have social media, we have the devices, we have these with content being pushed out directly to our devices to be consumed, readily available for everyone. The gravity of this extrapolated out 30 years from now, and we can see how these operations are much more easily executed and foisted upon populations.
And one could argue the most important newspaper in the world. The New York Times plays an enormous role in shaping the perception of the current world on the part of the politically active.
Shaping the perception of the current world.
Shaping the perception of the current world on the part of the politically active, educated classes.
On the part of the politically active, educated classes. This is New York Times. Fast forward now, we have various media outlets. We have media outlets that seem to lean either right or left. So there's that dichotomy there. So much to unpack with this thought process, but I think you understand where I'm going with this and where Mr. Chomsky is going with this information. And again, this is not me giving a specific nod to this gentleman, but again, just more thought, experimentation, and exploration into the inner workings and the psychology, worldview manipulation, maybe, relative to mass media, mainstream corporate media, tied in with government agencies and other corporate entities.
What happened years ago may have a bearing on what happens tomorrow. What happened years ago may have a bearing on what happens